Hey, last big video about metaethics. So what I've done in the previous ones, I talked about expressivism, which is the idea that when you're talking about morality, you're really just expressing how you feel about some things. Talked about reductionism, the idea that when you seem like you're talking about morality, you are, and morality is real, but it's thinking of it in moral terms is like a superficial way of thinking about something else that's really biological, anthropological, or something like that. Um, and then we've talked about these two facts about morality: the practicality of morality, the fact that moral thinking is decision making, and the logicality of morality, the fact that moral thinking seems to be an attempt to get some facts right about the world. So expressivism did a great job with practicality, but a pretty bad job with logicality. Reductionism did a great job with logicality, but was kind of hazy about the practicality part because the reductionists think that we've only got one possible motivation, and morality is just figuring out how to fulfill that one kind of desire or goal that we happen to have. So, what if somebody tries to do a view that actually encompasses both, that really accounts for both practicality and logicality? Well, it could be that no view could do that. So let's say that we're trying to look for a view that will be both it'll say that morality is both a matter of objective fact and also it's a matter of decision making. And you might think there's no objective facts that directly push us to make any decision. So there's decision making and there's learning the truth about the world, and they just have no relationship to one another. If you accept that view, you're what's called an eliminativist about morality. You think that everything that people say when they're thinking about morality is false. So people have believed in various kind of superstitious things all kinds of times and places. So here's an example from mostly northwestern Europe. People would talk about witches, and witches would, consort with Satan and give your cow the pox and stuff like that. But there aren't actually any witches. People kept talking about witches, and everything that they said was false. 500 years ago, you could have a couple of Northwestern Europeans, and they'd get together and they'd say, here's how you discover a witch. Oh, no, 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 that's not how you discover a witch. You discover a witch this other way. And they're both wrong because there's no way to discover a witch because there aren't any witches to discover. And someone say, here's how witches do their witchery craft stuff. Someone else says, no, 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 they do it in a totally different way. No, 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 you're all wrong because they don't do it at all because there aren't any witches. So the only thing that you can accurately say with the vocabulary of witchcraft is that there aren't any witches. The only time that we can, legitimately think in terms of witchcraft is when we're thinking in terms of fantasy fiction or history, when we're thinking about what people believed about witches a long time ago. But there aren't actually any witches. So because we couldn't reduce the vocabulary of witchcraft to a scientific vocabulary in the same way that we can with concepts like heat and water, we've eliminated the concept from our vocabulary entirely. So why would we eliminate this vocabulary from our overall language? Why not just keep it around? Why not talk both in terms of modern science and disease explanations and bacteria and stuff like that, and also talk in terms of witchcraft and their witchery powers and things like that? Why not just actually have both of them? Um, the trick is that we seem to be able to describe and explain the very same things using either of these vocabularies. So if somebody's cow comes down sick, you can say that there was a bacterial infection and it had certain symptoms and disease vectors and stuff. Or you can say that an evil witch had cast a curse on it or something like that. So they both seem to apply to the same thing. And then we want to know, well, do we really need two explanations for the same thing? I mean, did the cow get sick because both a witch cursed it and it got a bacterial infection? Is there no relationship between those two things? So we're really confident about the science vocabulary. We're pretty confident that there was a bacterium that got into the cow and that's why the cow is sick. And you could just say, well, but I've got this other explanation too. I've just got this witchcraft explanation and it just sits alongside the bacterial one. But it's weird to think that there's redundant explanations for the same event. So if we could reduce the vocabulary of witchcraft down to some science, then we'd be as confident about it as we are about the bacteria that we are certain about. But we can't do that. So since we figure there's not redundant explanations, we don't want to keep both of them. One of them is one that we're very confident about, the scientific one. The other one is one that we can't reduce down to science. Well, it looks like that one is not a necessary part of our worldview. There's no advantage that we get by talking about witches. They don't help us explain or understand anything, so let's stop talking about them. Well, you might think that morality is like that. So moral eliminativists are people who think that we should do with the vocabulary of morality what we have actually done with the vocabulary of witchcraft and just eliminate it from our vocabulary. Eliminativists are people who start out with a view called scientism. Scientism, this is not to be confused with science. Scientism is the claim that everything that is true can be said in the vocabulary of science. So everything that is true is either directly part of like physics or chemistry, or else is reducible to those vocabularies. So the eliminativist is going to say morality is not part of science, but moreover, it is not reducible down to science. Science doesn't say anything about what's good or bad. It does not provide any advice whatsoever. All it does is say how the world is. And you might think, well, but sometimes scientists have advice to give us, like about global warming. Insofar as you're a scientist, you actually have no idea whether global warming is good or bad. You can say what's happening, but you can't evaluate it. Now, of course, a scientist is also a person, so you can have a scientist who says, global's warming and here's what the effects are going to be, and then you take off your scientist hat and put on your regular person hat and say, and that would be bad, right? But a scientist as such can't say human life has value or anything like that. Science as such doesn't say that anything is good or bad or ought to be done. So the eliminativist says, if it's not part of science, it isn't true. But morality isn't part of science, so it isn't true. It's never the case that something is right or wrong or good or bad, or that you ought to do something or that you ought not do it. So another way of expressing the same basic idea is that if there were any moral facts, we couldn't learn about them. And the reason for that is just this. A moral fact is the fact that you ought to do something, you should not do something, something would be good or bad or right or wrong. But none of those are things that you could learn from sensation. The person who advocates scientism thinks that we do all of our learning from experience, right? So we sense things, we see things, we hear things, we correlate all of these little bits and pieces of experience, and then we generate general theories to explain why it is that we have the experiences that we have. The thing is, there's no experience of something's being good or bad. There's nothing that's sort of emanating from things in the world that could tip you off about whether they are good or bad. We can take a couple of examples. So let's imagine that you, a presumably decent person, find yourself watching some documentary footage from a death camp at the end of World War II, right? So at the end of World War II, GIs got into some of the Nazi death camps, and they filmed some of it, and it was horrific. And if you were to watch this, bodies stacked up like cordwood, emaciated corpses, right? You would be horrified or disgusted or angry or grief-stricken, all of which are reasonable, civilized emotions for a person to have in the face of something that horrific. But you can imagine that there's a Nazi watching the exact same video, and he's thinking, wow, that's great, it proves that it can be done. All right, so there's no goodness or badness emanating from the movie, right? You're seeing the exact same thing, but you're experiencing it very differently, or you're thinking of it in very different terms. So it's not putting out like a piece of goodness or badness information. Things that are good don't have a special glow around them or a special smell or something like that. So you can't tell by looking or smelling or touching whether something is good or bad. On the other hand, so that was two people having, seeing the same kind of a thing, but you could also have two situations that are extremely similar looking, and again, one of them might be good and one of them might be bad, even though you can't really tell the difference by looking. So imagine that you see a person shoot another person, and it's a murder and it's brutal and it's horrific, and then in another instance, you see something that looks pretty much exactly the same, but it's a case of self-defense, and it's an unfortunate situation, obviously, but it's not murder. It's not the same kind of real brutality and meanness. you could definitely put the same exact scene into either of two different stories, in one of which it's an okay thing to do, even if it's unfortunate, and the other one it's just a straightforwardly terrible thing to do, even though they look the same. There's no glow that's coming out of the good one that says, "Oh, this is an okay thing to do. This was self-defense. It is morally permissible." Whereas in the other case, there's a horrible reddish gleam coming out of it, saying, "Oh, this is evil." It's a matter of how you respond to things. So the eliminativist is going to say, you learn from sensation. You can't learn morality from sensation, so you can't learn morality. Even if there were moral facts, you could never know them. So the eliminativist view is, if there are objective facts about morality, then there are facts to which logicality applies. We're saying things that are true or false as a matter of objective reality, but they're also inherently motivational because once you know about them, you automatically act according to them. That's the practicality of morality. All right, the eliminativist says, there's nothing that you can discover in the world that automatically makes you make a decision. And we can see that with the learning kind of a case. That, when we show the death camp to you and the Nazi, you have completely different responses to it. All of the facts out in the world are exactly the same for both of you, but your responses are very different. So there's nothing out there in the world that's compelling your responses. You have this feeling and he's got a different feeling, and neither one of you is either right or wrong. You've just got feelings. This is an unusually difficult situation to overcome because the eliminativist is just saying, this thing doesn't exist. Prove to me that it does exist. Expressivists and reductionists said something positive about what was going on with morality, and so you could, pick apart the details of their conception of moral thinking. But the eliminativist just says, yeah, you're doing exactly what you thought you were doing, it's just that you're failing all the time. So there's a couple of kinds of responses that people have to the moral eliminativist. So one approach that you can take if you don't like eliminativism is to look for other things that are a lot like morality, but that nobody is willing to eliminate from our vocabulary. So the eliminativist says, here's an argument for my view, so you should accept my view. But the view is that there's nothing that you should do. That seems like a serious internal contradiction. So it seems as though if there's nothing that you should do, then there's no inference that you should draw. If there's no inferences that you should draw, then logic is also all false. Right? So if morality is false because it tells you what you should do, then logic would have to be false because it tells you how you should think. And that's a really awkward situation for the poor eliminativist to end up in, because now you want to ask, hey, eliminativist, you told me that there's nothing that I need to do, so I don't need to follow your advice? So while the anti-eliminativist is saying, if you get rid of morality, you've got to get rid of logic, too, the eliminativist is going to turn it around and say, well, wait a minute. Everything you guys just said about morality applies to beauty, too. So if you can't say that you should do something, then you can't say that you should infer something. But the eliminativist is going to turn that around and say, well, wait a minute. If something can be objectively good, couldn't it be objectively beautiful? And that doesn't seem very likely. So the eliminativist about morality is going to say, everything that we say about beauty seems to have both practicality and logicality, right? People are drawn to things that are beautiful. Artists try to produce things that are beautiful. And you can say, if something is beautiful, then something else is beautiful. Right. So it looks as though when you're talking about beauty, you are both talking about how to compose a work of art and how to feel about a work of art, what to appreciate. But you also seem to be stating facts. You say, this is beautiful. It is true that this is beautiful. If this is a beautiful painting, then that other painting has to also be beautiful because of some similarity that it has. So it looks as though talking about beauty is also both practical and logical in the same way that talking about what is good or bad or what you ought to do or ought not do would be. So it looks to the moral eliminativist like morality and aesthetics, or goodness and beauty, go together in just the same way that the anti-eliminativist said what you ought to do and how you ought to think would go together. So the eliminativist is going to say that seems really unlikely. It really seems as though what's beautiful is not a matter of fact, that beauty is strictly in the eye of the beholder, that people just like things or don't like things, and there's no such thing out there in the world as something actually being beautiful. So if morality is like aesthetics, if goodness is like beauty, and beauty isn't real, it's just a way that, it's a term that we use to, match up to some feelings that we have, well, then likewise, nothing is actually good. If nothing is objectively beautiful, then nothing is objectively good. So an eliminativist is going to say that beauty and goodness go together and we should eliminate both of them from our way of thinking, whereas the anti-eliminativist is going to say that logic and goodness go together, so we should keep both of them in our thinking. And if you just stop there, you're in a pretty unstable situation. So eliminativists about morality have tried to also be eliminativists about logic. They say actually there's no such thing as a good or a bad inference. There's no way that you should or shouldn't think. And on the other hand, moral realists have tried being, or anti-eliminativists about morality have tried also being anti-eliminativists about beauty. They've said, well, maybe there are some objective facts about what is and isn't beautiful. Both of those views are kind of hard to sustain. So that seemed kind of awkward all around, but the anti-eliminativist does have some other more direct approaches. The anti-eliminativist can say, look, you guys are starting out with the assumption that everything that we say has to be based on observation or a theory to account for observation, but you dropped out the fact that we're making decisions. I mean, you are making decisions. That's an unavoidable fact about human beings. Given that you are trying to make a decision, there's got to be decisions that are better or worse than other ones. You are currently, as an eliminativist, trying to discover the truth about something, and implicit in that is the thought that the truth is better to believe than a falsehood would be. So since you are in fact making decisions, you're trying to govern yourself, you implicitly, just by doing things, believe that there are things that are better or worse than other things. Why can't that be enough to show that there's a moral reality out there? Why would we insist that moral reality has to give us the same kind of facts as science gives us? Why would we insist that it has to explain why we have the experiences that we do, instead of explaining why we should make the decisions that we should? Or here's another kind of a way of putting the same basic idea. Morality isn't disconnected from all the rest of your thinking. Thinking has to do with action. Just in general, the only way that you can tell that somebody has any beliefs at all, much less what beliefs they have, is by watching what they do and trying to interpret and understand how they think the world must be. Thinking is intrinsically hooked up with acting. All right, well, moral thinking is specifically thinking that's directly applied to action. It's closer to action than most of our other thinking. So if moral thinking is logically connected with our other thinking, and moral thinking is all wrong, then it's really hard to see how any of our other thinking could be accurate. So on this line of argument, the mere fact that an awful lot of our beliefs about the world are pretty much got to be true goes to show that moral beliefs in particular have to be mostly true, or at least largely true. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to guide us in action and also have logical connections to other beliefs. So let's assume that somewhere in all of that we came up with an argument that we liked against eliminativism. If you don't care for any of expressivism, reductionism, or eliminativism, you've adopted a view called moral realism, which is the claim that there are irreducible moral facts. There's facts, so expressivism is false. There are moral facts, so eliminativism is false, and they are irreducible, so reductionism must be false. Now, in this class, we effectively just have to assume that realism is true, and that's not because I can certify that it is definitely true. I mean, all of these views have representatives who are incredibly gifted, and there's very complicated arguments about all of them, way beyond anything that I've talked about here. But if realism isn't true, then you're going to have to put in an awful lot of thinking to figure out how we could make moral decisions. If expressivism is true, then an ethics class would just be sort of grunting out our feelings at one another, or would be an incredibly complicated process of figuring out how it is that we can turn those grunts into some kind of actual articulate thinking. If reductionism is true, then an ethics class would consist mostly in having biologists come in and speak to us, or anthropologists come in and speak to us, to tell us what we're going to do, and that's not exactly a form of decision making. If eliminativism is true, then there's actually just nothing to say in the entire class. In just the same way that Introduction to Witchcraft isn't a class that exists because there are no witches, Introduction to Ethics wouldn't exist because there would be no ethics. So we have to assume that realism is true, not because I can certify that it is, but because on all of the other views, coming up with some natural way of thinking about moral decision making is incredibly complicated. It would take at least the entire semester just to figure out how it is that expressivism could be compatible with moral decision making, and likewise with the other kinds of views. So just for simplicity's sake, we're going to assume that moral realism is true, that there are objective moral facts that we can discover. But that leaves us with another big question. Well, what about these facts? What kind of facts are they? And there's one specific question. Are any of them general facts, facts that cover a wide variety of cases? So we can think about moral views, moral convictions at a couple of different levels. There's principles and there's judgments. And to be clear, this is one way of using some words on this. In regular English, you can use these words in slightly different ways. So this is a little bit sort of gerrymandered and artificial jargon for our purposes. So a principle is a piece of moral advice that applies to many cases, whereas a judgment is a moral claim that applies to a single case. So something like don't lie would be a principle because it applies to all of the cases in which you had the ability or temptation to lie, whereas don't lie to Bob about what you saw is a judgment because it applies to the specific case of this thing that you saw and Bob. So all realists will agree that there are true moral judgments, because if there's ever anything that you should do, then you can say, well, I should do this thing here and now. But then we can have a question, are there any general principles that might be true, or is it only just concrete, very particular advice? So a moral principle would need to have four different qualities, or a good moral principle would need to have four different qualities. One is that it's got to be general. The whole point of a principle as opposed to a judgment is that it applies to many cases, so it has to have generality, breadth of application. It has to be concrete, and what that means is that when you apply it to one of those cases to which it applies, you get a judgment. You don't have to keep thinking about it. Once you take the principle and the situation that you're in and you plug them into one another, what comes out of the principle is a judgment about what to do. At that point, you are done with your moral decision making. You've figured out what to do. The judgment that comes out of the principle is a judgment about what to do right now, and then you do it. If it doesn't do that, then it's more of a sort of a vague rule of thumb. It's not really a guide to action so much as kind of a hint or a reminder or a suggestion, and that's not quite what we're looking for with a principle. Principles need to be short. You could always just take all of the judgments and put them together and end up with something that's general and concrete, because it would just be a list. So for instance, instead of saying don't lie, which is general and concrete, you want to build in all the exceptions, you could just have a really long instruction, tell all and only the following lies, and then list out every possible permissible lie. Right? Just all of the judgments, just list them out. That wouldn't really be very helpful. I mean, that wouldn't show that there were general moral facts. All that would show is that you can put and between an awful lot of particular moral facts. So a moral principle needs to be brief. It needs to have a wide breadth of application, but to be simple itself. And last, of course, you don't have a good principle unless the advice that it gives you is true advice. So a moral principle would be a general moral claim that gives specific advice about what to do in different situations. It's got to be short enough that you can kind of remember it and it's genuinely multi-applicable, and the principle has to give you good advice. When you apply it to a situation, the judgment that it feeds out has to be a correct judgment about what you should do, and if you follow that judgment, you have to be doing the right thing. But it seems like it's pretty unlikely that you could have something with all four of those qualities. It seems like if you have three of them, you probably don't have the other one. So something like this: you particular person, tell this particular person this embarrassing truth now in these words. That is completely concrete. It's actually fairly short, and it might be excellent advice, but it is not remotely general. On the other hand, take something like do the right thing. Well, that is completely general. It applies to literally every case. It is very short. It's only 4 words. I guarantee you that do the right thing is correct advice. On the other hand, it doesn't actually tell you what to do. Now your job is just to figure out what the right thing is, and your principle didn't actually give you any real advice. All right. Or you might say, well, why don't we just have, something that is accurate because it's got all the exceptions built in. So don't lie except in this case, or except in that case, or except in the other case. And not only are you going to get an infinitely long list of exceptions, you're also going to get an infinitely long list of exceptions to the exceptions. So we can say something like, don't lie except to Nazis. Just, on general principles, Nazis don't deserve the truth. But then occasionally you're going to come across a Nazi that you need to tell the truth to. So you're going to say, don't lie except to Nazis, unless the Nazi is doing some particular thing. So you're going to find exceptions to exceptions to exceptions to exceptions. So it's not only infinitely complex, it's a higher order of infinity complex, because every exception will have an infinite number of exceptions to it, and all of those exceptions will on their own have infinitely many exceptions. So it's too long to be remotely useful or applicable. Then on the other hand, you can have something that is general, concrete, and short, but it's probably not going to be correct. Something like don't lie. Intuitively, most of us feel like there is the occasional permissible lie. So don't lie, while it's a good rule of thumb or it's a good fallback, it's not actually a true principle. Right? It is not, most of us think, always wrong to lie. Right? The ones that actually can fit all of these are going to be things that tell you not to do things that you probably don't need to be told not to do. Something like don't torture babies for fun. I mean, that's general in that it applies to all babies. It is concrete in that, we know exactly what not to do. It's really pretty short, and yes, you should not torture babies for fun. But you didn't really need to be told that. So it looks as though if you can find a true principle, it's probably going to give you advice that you really didn't need very much, and advice that would, in the real world, never apply to any situation that you would ever find yourself in. So there's a good reason to think that there's no such thing as a general moral truth, that there might not be any such thing as a moral principle. That doesn't mean that there aren't true moral convictions, it's just that they're judgments about what to do in a particular situation. So there are generalists who believe that there are general moral truths. There are particularistic views which say that principles don't play an essential role in our moral thinking because they're probably not really true. So in this class, we're going to look at 2 generalistic views, utilitarianism and deontology or Kantianism. These are going to be moral realist views that try to give us a general idea for how to behave. They're going to try to give us big rules to apply to a lot of situations. So according to these views, moral thinking consists in taking principles and applying them to situations, and then a judgment is fed out, and then you need to follow the judgment. The other view that we're going to look at, Aristotle's view, sometimes called virtue ethics, is particularistic. Aristotle doesn't think that we can write down general moral advice. He thinks that there are moral facts, but he thinks that the way to learn them is by sensitivity and thoughtfulness and imagination and, having some rules of thumb, but more having a big picture of what a good life looks like, and then just being a thoughtful person with good judgment. He doesn't think that you can write it down as rules. So that view is a particularistic view. Neither of these is a crazy view by any stretch of the imagination. The reason that I emphasized the anti-generalistic argument is that everybody typically thinks, well, principles are very, very important for moral thinking. So that was the prejudice that I wanted to shake you from. It is entirely possible that principles are vital to moral thinking, and utilitarians and Kantians will say so, but I wanted to give you the idea that maybe they aren't, that that's something worth thinking about. And this concludes our introduction to metaethics.